Washington, D.C.
Tonight, the final countdown. Senators are racing to clear a packed agenda before leaving Washington for August recess. Republican Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota joins us from Capitol Hill live on what can get done before the clock runs out. Plus, Democrats' path forward after a progressive win in Michigan. And with the midterms less than 90 days off, we speak with House Minority Whip Katherine Clark about her party's path to victory in November and what Democrats would do with the House majority. Plus, Iran risks return. Oil surging today as markets wait for signs of a firm deal to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, reviving fears that rising energy costs could keep the Fed on a hawkish path ahead of Friday's jobs report. From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons.
And Joe, we kick off tonight's coverage with a race against the clock on Capitol Hill as the Senate tries to make progress on a stacked agenda ahead of a scheduled 5-week recess. A stopgap funding bill, presidential nominees, a Russian sanctions bill, college sports and cryptocurrency legislation, and, of course, a formal vote on Todd Blanche's confirmation to serve as Attorney General. We'll have Republican Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota live in just a moment, as Joe mentioned. But first, we get things started as we turn to Bloomberg's Megan Scully here in our Washington, D.C. bureau. So, Megan, it's 5 p.m. on Thursday. Recess is supposed to begin. Do we have any idea whether or not it will as scheduled?
We have zero idea. Earlier this week, Senator John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, called this schedule a train wreck, and it has essentially become that as the week has gone on. But I will say miracles tend to happen in the Senate on Thursday nights as the lawmakers start to get anxious to get home. They have their flights booked. They want to start this recess. So we'll see if things start to come together quickly on at least some of those items on the agenda that you mentioned.
Well, and on one of those items, Todd Blanche's confirmation in particular, he obviously was able to get out of the Judiciary Committee. We know Susan Collins has said she will not be voting for him. Ruben Gallego says he will be there to vote despite his wife's health issues. So walk us through the math and whether or not the votes are there right now.
So assuming Senator McConnell does not vote, he announced today that he was discharged from a rehab center and is recovering at home. He did not say that he would be voting. So we'll assume that he is not. Assuming he does not vote, then Republicans can only lose 2 on the Blanche vote if all Democrats vote and vote in opposition. We already know Susan Collins is a no. There are 2 other on the fence, Senator Bill Cassidy and Senator Lisa Murkowski. We don't know how they're going to vote. If they both vote against it, then the nomination becomes the first that is defeated on the Senate floor since John Tower in 1989.
How about that? Unclear if she has a working weekend, or all of us for that matter. Megan Scully, thank you so much, Megan, and joining us now for more. And I suspect we'll learn a lot more from Republican Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota, a member of the Armed Services, Environment and Public Works, Veterans Affairs, Banking Committees. Senator, great to see you. Appreciate your walking over to the rotunda for us this evening. Maybe you can shed some light. We know the airports are gassing up jets just in case you guys are ready. Are you heading home tonight?
Well, I'm quite certain I'm not heading home tonight. In fact, I got exhausted just listening to Kaylee read all of the long list of things we have to do. But you did a good job of setting it up. But I think it's really important for people to know that the highest priority right now of that long list is a continuing resolution that allows us to keep the government funded through December 11th, which means through the election, means through the August recess, through September and October. So that's our first and highest priority because that takes the pressure off of a lot of other things. It's also encouraging because it passed, the procedural measure passed 89-4. So obviously there's overwhelming support to do that. There's probably going to be an amendment vote or 2 prior to that. But our next scheduled vote is tonight about 11 o'clock on the confirmation of 74 nominations by the president that are an en bloc group. And so unless Democrats agree to give some time back, they'll run the clock out till roughly 11 o'clock tonight. That'll be our next vote. By that point, maybe we'll know more.
Sheesh.
Yeah,
well, as we consider the state of play here, what I also was discussing with Megan was the confirmation of Todd Blanche. And President Trump was actually just asked about this, Senator, in the Oval Office by a reporter, whether he would get personally involved in lobbying any holdouts. Do you expect he's going to have to? Might Cassidy and Lisa Murkowski, your colleagues hold that firm?
Sure. So important point. I mean, you're down to those two. One of them can vote no, and the other one would have to vote yes for him to pass, at least as it currently stands. Would the president have to get personally involved? Perhaps. Obviously he doesn't have a lot of leverage with Bill Cassidy, who lost an election, his primary, of course, to a Trump-supported opponent. Senator Murkowski, on the other hand, who represents Alaska, probably has a little leverage to get a few things. I don't know. I'm not in the room. But I would hope that one of the two of them, and frankly, maybe both of them. One thing about Bill Cassidy, since he's lost his primary, he's been working at double the pace to get important things done. So they both have the right ethic. Hopefully the president, if he does weigh in, can persuade one or both of them to support Todd, to vote for Todd Blanche. So we can both get a good attorney general, and I do believe Todd will be a very good attorney general, but at the same time, move the agenda along.
You believe he would act purely in the best interests of the Constitution, Senator, as opposed to being the president's personal defense attorney?
Oh, I'm very confident of that. I think as the acting attorney general and as the deputy, he has done a marvelous job of doing exactly that. I think he's demonstrated great independence, in the current position. So, yeah, I'm confident of that. And he's a very qualified attorney.
I'd like to ask you about someone who already is a confirmed member of the president's cabinet, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who President Trump is having to stand by today, saying he's extremely happy with after reporting of a dust-up between the two at Camp David recently over the issue of munitions. I'm sure you've seen the reporting we all have about how munitions stockpiles for the country are running low. And I wonder if, as a member of the Armed Services Committee, you can shed some real visibility onto what we actually do have available to us at the moment, or how dire the need for more funding to replenish munitions may be.
Sure. Well, first of all, we never have too many munitions for whatever situation might arise. But obviously, we're not getting a lot of help with the Strait of Hormuz from some of our allies in the region or in Europe. However, they've got their hands full with another war between Russia and Ukraine, obviously, another important munitions challenge there. But I'm confident that the United States has what we need to get the job done, both at the Strait of Hormuz and to the larger, with regard to the larger war with Iran itself. But at the same time as some shooting is going on, the president continues with a hopeful, I think, attitude towards some sort of other resolution through negotiations. And I think that the rift, if you will, between the president and the secretary is largely over-dramatized, if you will. The president, I've had many dramatic discussions with him, but I always walk away knowing that he's got my back and he knows I have his. I suspect that again, that a lot of that is hyper-dramatized. But the munition situation is certainly one that is that's not certainly trifling, but at the same time, it also signals the importance of us getting the type of budget reconciliation package and the $1.5 trillion defense budget overall that needs to meet the moment and needs to meet the time. Mm-hmm. And that involves large missiles, obviously things like the Sentinel replacing the Minuteman IIIs with the nuclear warheads, all the way down to small drones, counter drones, interceptors, which is, of course, a big issue both in the Middle East and in Ukraine. So, but we're also seeing our companies step up in a big way. For example, the Patriot plant in Germany is ahead of schedule in terms of its ability to roll out. So I'm not overly concerned about it. There's no country in the world that stacks up against the United States of America, and I think we're proving that in Iran.
We certainly appreciate the spirit of that statement, though. When you hear reporting, Senator, and you probably learned this or knew this long before we did when we read it in Reuters, that we're out of ATACMS, that the number of long-range ballistic missiles that have been used in the initial weeks of fighting have left us depleted here. And my gosh, it takes, 2 years to replace them, knowing that this money is in the offing. We've got real bottlenecks when it comes to defense manufacturing. Will it take 2 years to replenish our stockpiles of ATACMS missiles?
I don't know that it would, but quite honestly, what we're seeing is our primes and our others, including startup companies, are stepping up. And a lot of the reason they're stepping up is because we've passed important legislation, and Pete Hegseth and Steve Feinberg, the Deputy Secretary of War, have done a marvelous job of providing longer-term, multi-year procurement contracts, putting up seed money to provide the kind of market signal, demand signals to the companies to invest greater amounts. And of course, let's not forget the way wars are being fought is changing so dramatically that the innovators in our country are now all in play for contracts to do everything from offensive drones to counter drone technologies. So yeah, it's not nearly as dire as is being dramatized. On the other hand, it's not to be trifled with either. We have to step up and invest heavily in a depleted military, largely as a result of the previous administration and other administrations, Democratic administrations in the last couple of decades, that have just seen fit to cut our budgets and deplete our capabilities, and that depletes, unfortunately, the deterrence of the most of the other countries against the most powerful military in the world.
And we appreciate you weighing in on this as a member of the Armed Services Committee. You, of course, Senator, are also a member of the Banking Committee. And it's in that spirit I'd like to ask you about some Bloomberg reporting today about phone calls that have taken place between President Trump and the new chair of the Federal Reserve, Kevin Warsh. Apparently, they've spoken by phone multiple times since you and your colleagues confirmed Warsh back in May. It's not clear, according to our colleagues' reporting, whether monetary policy was discussed. But if it were, is that appropriate in your mind for the independent Federal Reserve chairman to be speaking with the president with some frequency?
I think it would be strange if the chair of the Federal Reserve wasn't talking to the president somewhat regularly. Obviously, there are lots of issues to talk about, not just interest rates or monetary policy specifically, but lots of other things with regard to the economy. I mean, Kevin Warsh has an army of staff of 22,000 people who provide insights and analysis, and all the work that the Fed does. Obviously, a president who's focused on the economy is doing his best to bring down prices and bring up production and grow the economy of our country, would have good reason to talk to the person that he nominated to be the Federal Reserve Chairman. So I've never found that to be a problem. I didn't find it to be a problem if it was happening with Jay Powell either. I always found it a problem when he pretended that it wasn't. But no, I don't find it offensive at all. Again, as long as the Federal Reserve Chairman and the Fed itself, the committee, remains independent in its analysis and its decision-making on whether to lower or raise or hold interest rates where they are.
All right, Senator, thank you so much for joining us. Republican Senator Kevin Cramer of North Dakota, thank you, and safe travels to you whenever it is you're able to leave Washington. Now, turning to the White House, where President Trump convened the press in the Oval Office a short time ago and spoke about the ongoing negotiations with Iran. He was asked about the Strait of Hormuz, as Iran is suggesting an agreement with Oman over the waterway has been made in principle. Here's that exchange.
Has a deal been reached to reopen the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, I don't want to say it has been. It's sort of open right now. We have a thing called the blockade headed up by the U.S. Navy, and we control it. And now we control it, but they can always shoot something. They always have something or drop a mine. I think we're doing very well. I just, I'm involved in the negotiation. I think we're doing fine. It could be soon.
For more, we're joined by Bloomberg's Jeff Mason live from the North Lawn of the White House. So, Jeff, it could be soon. We've heard that before. And what exactly is it that could be soon? A deal between Iran and Oman, or a deal between Iran and the United States?
All good questions. And yes, we have heard that multiple times before. The president likes to indicate that a deal is close, even when sometimes the facts don't necessarily support that. In this case, the facts do suggest that Iran and Oman are close to getting some kind of a deal, although some of the elements of that deal may not be things that President Trump will like. They include, according to reporting, Iran wanting to charge a fee for U.S. ships and also have some sort of controls over Israeli material that would go through the Strait or anything that would be shipping for Israel. So those are two things that no doubt are not at the high end of top of the list, rather, of things that the president would like to see in this kind of a deal. So we'll have to wait and see how he reacts once more details are clear. But he is suggesting that the U.S. and he specifically are involved.
This is, of course, not what brought the president into the Oval Office, Jeff. He was there to sign a couple of EOs, one of which imposes a 15% tariff on polysilicon derivative goods, something that's been moving solar stocks recently. But there's also an order on ending birth tourism, as they call it. Stephen Miller spoke about this as well alongside the president. What does he have the power to do through EO?
Well, good question. On the latter, this EO with regard to immigration, Joe, is a follow-up to a ruling from the Supreme Court that this White House was not happy with. They were looking to have the Supreme Court support their contention that the Constitution does not allow for anyone who's born in the United States to receive U.S. citizenship. So with this latest executive order, the president and the White House, and as you mentioned, Stephen Miller, are trying to essentially block birth tourism, I guess, is what they refer to it as. And that's the idea that someone from a non-citizen would come from another country with the intention of giving birth here while saying they're going to Disneyland or going to some sort of tourist attraction. That's what Stephen Miller specifically said. I think the big question here is whether this will withstand additional legal scrutiny, because the previous executive order that the president issued along these lines was struck down by the Supreme Court.
Interesting to hear Disney invoked today. Jeff, thank you so much. Live from the White House, Bloomberg's Jeff Mason. Coming up on Balance of Power, we'll check in on the markets, plus an unnerving report today on OpenAI's models colluding, coordinating ahead of the Hugging Face hack. We'll have that and much more ahead on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kaylee Lyons. I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for being with us. Oil prices jumping today after Iran released its draft plan for the Strait of Hormuz we were just discussing, as yet another day passes without a long-term deal between the U.S. and Iran. This as the first lockup period for SpaceX stock expires, putting more than 900 million shares newly on the market. For more on how the markets performed today, we turn to Power Moves with Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, live at World Headquarters in New York. Nora, we may as well start with SpaceX. No one even blinked today. The stock went up. I guess the move was yesterday?
Certainly. We saw shares of SpaceX ending higher by about 6%. That, of course, following the fact that $100 billion worth of shares were released from lockup agreements. We've been seeing the stock really being on a roller coaster ride since the biggest IPO in history. So all eyes still remain on the company, especially as we think about the AI build out. We just got results out of the company just a couple days ago, and it was a pretty strong report. But where a lot of the attention still lies is how much money they're pouring into their artificial intelligence metrics and build out. Outside of that, I'm also keeping an eye on the broader market. So we also did see stocks essentially being driven by the larger macro environment. The focus as of late has been on the Middle East, as we know. But today, you really saw sentiment in the market fixated on the fact that the deal between the U.S. and Iran still remains elusive. And so you saw concerns about whether or not a deal moving forward with the Strait of Hormuz would actually weigh on inflation and actually create more inflationary concerns. You saw oil prices spiking, Brent crude hanging around $83 a barrel, and WTI also higher by more than 2%. We saw energy the best performing group in the S&P 500. No surprise there, given the fact of the moves that you're seeing in the oil market. But if you take a look also at the bond market, we saw bonds lower. We saw yields higher across the curve. If you take a look at the 2s, 10s, and 30s, we see the policy-sensitive 2-year yield currently sitting at about 4.2%. So now attention turns to the jobs report, which we'll get tomorrow.
Indeed, we will. All right, Bloomberg's Nora Melinda, thank you so much. Tonight, some news on the AI front that is causing a stir after OpenAI said the artificial intelligence models behind that Hugging Face attack began communicating with each other undetected as early as May. OpenAI staffers revealing the development at a cybersecurity conference, saying agents and AI models spent months communicating with one another on an unprecedented level, working together to break out of their testing environment, underscoring growing concerns over safety. For more, we're joined by Bloomberg's Mike Shepard. So, Mike, if these things can all get together and plot, that doesn't necessarily seem like a great thing.
Well, Kaylee, back when we were talking about the Mythos release in April, that really seemed to be the moment where we realized that all the fears that have been spoken about hypothetically surrounding AI risks were suddenly more tangible. And now they seem even more palpable still, following the evidence that some models, not only from OpenAI, but also from Meta, which disclosed its own little escape by one of its models, and also by Anthropic as well, that these systems have a way and at times almost a mind of their own in terms of how they behave. They are very task-focused. The researchers who spoke at this conference that our colleague Maggie Eastland attended yesterday in Las Vegas. And they also said that the models can even be willful and will cheat to be able to achieve their goals, which sort of explains some of the behavior that we saw detailed in the report.
Wow. All right. So just to be clear, in this test, once again, guardrails were lowered to allow the model to explore the testing environment, and it went out of bounds. If the guardrails had been up, if this model had been tested by the White House, for instance, could that still have happened?
That's a great question, and we're not even sure what the U.S. government's testing regime would do. Would they put it into what they call a sandbox, which, Joe, is one of these secure environments that is, in theory at least, offline, not supposed to be connected to the internet, and some place where they can remove the guardrails and really see what a model can do without any of the safety constraints imposed upon it. So that's one question. We don't know exactly what would government testing turn up. But two, how would the models behave? And do they fully understand all the parameters and which ones need to be in place to prevent this from happening? Because as we see, the models actually started working together to try to solve this problem, not really intending any ill necessarily. But if a hacker really were trying to deploy this, and this is a point that the researchers made, this could become the kind of thing that is the example of agentic attacks going forward.
So this is Skynet. We've arrived.
Yeah, it's frightening. And it's one thing to consider how the government would handle testing of its own. It's another to consider whether or not the government is going to be doing much testing of its own on a voluntary or mandatory basis as well. Do these instances of clearly models being capable of not following the rules set for them make it more likely that the White House is interested in shifting to a more mandatory regime?
Well, they have already put in place the security order that the president signed back in June, trying to address some of the cyber risks that artificial intelligence poses. One of the things was the establishment of a clearinghouse about AI-detected cyber vulnerabilities. That would enable companies around the world, if AI were to flag a gap in their networks, they would be able to patch those holes. The other is safety reviews, and those are envisioned as voluntary under the government program. Companies would be able to opt in. But naturally, it does carry the idea of a golden seal of approval from the government to help companies assure the public that the models are safe and also provide some order and stability and predictability for the for the government and companies alike. Now, the question is, Kaylee, will they want this to become mandatory? That is a call that Dario Amodei, the chief executive of Anthropic, has been making repeatedly. He did so just last week. But other companies and the administration certainly are really not in favor of anything mandatory. For President Donald Trump, we know that, regulation is really not something he's generally in support of. And he's also mindful of not restraining the growth of AI in this country. It's something that is a centerpiece of his agenda, and it's also key to the competition with China.
This is quite a story, Shep. Thank you so much, as always. Coming up on Balance of Power, President Trump still dominates the MAGA movement, but who's best positioned to inherit it? Mario Parker joins us next on Bloomberg. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons in Washington. Thanks for being with us. President Trump is downplaying talk that he has already chosen Vice President J.D. Vance as his successor in 2028.
Mr. President, there is a report that you told donors that they need to get J.D. Vance elected in 2028. Is that your official endorsement?
No. It's. I heard about it a little while ago. I think he's great, but we're way too early to even be thinking about that. Okay?
And while it's way too early for an endorsement, the president, of course, has joked any blame for the administration's Iran strategy. One of the more controversial issues in his second term would be Vance's to inherit. Remember?
I like that idea, sure. What? This way, if it works out, I'm going to take the credit. If it doesn't work out, I'm blaming J.D. You better be careful, J.D. He's going to turn his plane around and get the hell out of here. Yeah, I like that idea. I think it's a good idea.
That's when Vance was leading negotiations. For now, Trump is keeping Vance close and the rest of the 2028 field guessing. And Bloomberg's Mario Parker joins us now to dig into this. For this week's Debrief, Mario, it's great to see you. Do we even know what Donald Trump wants in a successor?
We don't just yet, Joe. And the first thing that people said when I made the phone calls earlier was a surprise, and then immediately followed by that, the caveat that the president will change his mind. He will say different things to different audiences. His mind isn't made up. It's too early yet. The one thing, to answer your question, that we do know that he would like is loyalty. We know that he values loyalty over most qualities. Not sure that even as the president has sought to burnish his legacy, not sure that he's thought ahead to who the successor is deeply.
Well, so this idea of Vance then may be a little bit too far too soon. There's a going thought in Washington that he doesn't want any Republican to succeed him, that it would be very much in his personality to prefer to see, frankly, a Democrat win, knowing that there is no Republican to compete with Donald Trump or to take the mantle. What do you think of that?
Yeah, well, that's one of the schools of thought there is the fact that you've seen the president, I mean, even over the last 24 hours or so, you've seen the president become just much more animated with the midterm election. He has a contrast to draw there. We've seen him draw those contrasts before with his predecessor, both Barack Obama and Joe Biden as well, right? Now, in terms of J.D. Vance, one of the things that the president has said previously was that likely, it's in all fairness, he's the vice president. It's likely that he would be the heir apparent. Not a very full-throated endorsement, but again, not sure that that's anything personal toward J.D. Vance as much as it is, when have we ever seen the president be comfortable taking a second fiddle? Can you even envision the last 2 years of the president's term where he's essentially handing the reins over to J.D. Vance, and contrast that with the fact that just how much power we've seen the president try to exude in this 2.0, right? So whether or not he would want to be a lame duck, that's just really tough for people to
you
swallow.
were at the correspondence dinner. He put a 2028 cap on, didn't he?
And he's joking.
He just likes playing with you guys.
He does. And to that point, Joe.
Or is he?
To that point, he's a reality star, right? He's someone, if you recall, back in the VP sweepstakes of 2024, we waited until down to the wire of the Republican National Convention to find out exactly who his vice president would be.
Hey, just real quick, we talked to Glenn Youngkin, who's sitting in this same chair you were in yesterday at this time, and of course we had to ask him about his 2028 plans. Very carefully selected words in his answer. Listen to what he said.
I've been asked this a lot, and I've answered it the same way every time, which is I don't anticipate being on the debate stage. Somebody just asked me in an interview, is this about 2028? I said, no.
No. Until it's a yes. How often are we going to hear answers like this as the field is assembled?
All of the time. Everyone has to play coy. I did run past the notion of Youngkin running. Folks say that he would do pretty good in the first two states, Iowa, South Carolina. After that, it's a toss-up. But they do, make no mistake about it, they do see this as J.D. Vance's field to lose if he so choose to
That's great, because it's closer than people think. Mario, thank you. Bloomberg's Mario Parker. That's the debrief. Kaylee?
Well, Joe, while Republicans consider what direction the party will take come 2028, Democrats are facing a reckoning from the left in this 2026 midterm cycle, exemplified by the victory of progressive Abdul Ed-Sayed in Michigan's Senate primary this week. We spoke with Democratic Congresswoman Katherine Clark of Massachusetts, the House Democratic whip, earlier today, and began by asking her what his win signals.
Let me tell you what I'm seeing from my perspective, both here in my district in Massachusetts, around the country, and in Michigan. And that is that the American people are feeling such pain in this economy that they are looking for fighters. They are looking for people who are going to see their family and stand up for them, help give them that solid floor and no ceiling on their success. And so we are seeing candidates in Michigan and across the country that are doing just that. And that's why Democrats are meeting with success, because the American people know whose side we're on, and it's theirs. Whether it's the cost of housing or gas or groceries, everywhere I go, those concerns are raised, and people are worried about being able to afford and access health care. So our candidates are doing well because that's where our focus is, and that's who we are going to be fighting for when we get the majority in November.
You know, Congresswoman, just to follow on Kaylee's question, I've got your district in mind, the 5th Congressional District in Massachusetts. You have to talk to the guys in line at Kelly's Roast Beef in Revere and also appeal to people who are walking out of their mansions in Winchester. It's an amazing contrast of values and income levels. And I wonder if your experience in your district is the answer to some of these questions about inward fighting in the Democratic Party.
Well, Joe, I think you're absolutely right. My district does have a wide variety to broad, proud, working class communities and neighborhoods to some of the wealthiest zip codes in the country. But what unites my district, what we're seeing around the country, is that people want a fair shot. And people feel like this system is rigged against them. And there's an understanding that we cannot continue on this path where the very, very wealthy get the tax breaks. The very, very wealthy are able to pay into the White House and get their businesses selected for insider deals. And regular working people, everyday people, are left behind. And it's a story that I hear, and one of the most heartbreaking examples that I have heard in my own district and in states where I've been recently, like Arizona, is the story of moms who are telling me they are eating one meal a day. And they say it very matter-of-factly, that this is what they have to do to make sure that their kids have enough to eat. In the richest country in the history of the world, this is an absolute shame and an absolute failure of the Republican Party to see working people and make sure they can meet the basic needs of their family. And so we know that we can do both things. We can be leaders in innovation like we are here in my district. We can be leaders in academic ideas that come out of the lab and go into the private marketplace. But we can't do it if we leave the middle class and working people behind. And that is what people are experiencing in this economy.
Well, when we consider then what legislative answers may be for those issues, for affordability issues like on health care, as you were speaking to a moment ago, are notions like Medicare for all the solution? Your job is to count votes. I wonder if you see the vote count as being there, even if you get the majority for some of these ideas that are being propagated specifically by the left.
Yeah. So job number one for us in the majority with healthcare is putting back these devastating cuts that we're already seeing effects here in Massachusetts and certainly across the country, especially in rural parts of the country where rural hospitals, who are often the largest employer in an area, are closing or are scheduled to close because they know they aren't going to make it with the Medicaid cuts that the Republicans very conveniently scheduled to truly hit the American people right after the midterms. midterms. But we are going to hold them accountable for that, and we are going to make sure that we put that money back. But it's going to be more than that. It's going to be, how do we look at our system of prior authorizations and make sure that when your doctor recommends something, you can afford it and have access to the medication or the treatment your doctor prescribed. These are the fundamentals for families. That what I'm hearing around the country is a deep, deep anxiety and anger that these basics have been given away to the wealthiest of Americans, and they are being fed a bunch of lies from the White House and Republicans in the House. Just yesterday, Trump said that the economy is rated an A+. I can tell you everywhere I go, people give this economy an F. And we are fighting for an America that they can afford. And that is why we are going to meet with political success, because we're on the side of the American people.
So could you pass Medicare for all, as Kayleigh asks? Is that something worth pursuing? I'm assuming you believe you're going to have the majority in the House.
Yeah, I think we are going to have the majority in the House. And I think we are also, we will see where our numbers are. But there's lots of positive things we can do for health care that, that are going to be positive steps towards a shared goal, whether you're on the left or the center or the right of the Democratic Party. And that is health care as a right and not as a privilege for those who can afford it. So the specific vehicle, the specific legislation, we will see how that comes together. But what I can tell you is that the American people are finding it harder and harder to find health care, never mind afford it. So we have to look at this problem on a really global issue, going everywhere to how do we educate doctors? How do we make sure we have the professional nursing force that we need? How do we make sure we have pediatricians, all the way to how do we support mental health in our communities and make sure that everybody can have a doctor where and when their family needs it.
Congresswoman, I'd also like to ask you about some more immediate business that you could be contending with upon return from recess. The Senate, before it breaks for its own recess, very well could advance a continuing resolution to fund the government through December 11th. If indeed it gets sent over to the House, do you plan to vote to avoid a shutdown? Will the majority of your Democratic colleagues?
We absolutely want to see us fund government by the end of our fiscal deadline, which is the end of September. And that is a deep commitment that we have. What the Senate has proposed is a big improvement from what the House Republicans proposed before sending us home for recess. So we look forward to reviewing that and getting to yes with our colleagues.
Our thanks to Democratic Congresswoman Katherine Clark of Massachusetts with us on Balance of Power. We'll have much more ahead as we assemble our political panel next on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Listen, what we've seen, of course, is what we saw in Michigan last night, where the Democrat Party is waging a battle for its very soul, and you see socialists winning it. Yeah. And now you have a socialist candidate for Senate in Michigan, and you're about to see.
He's not a member of the DSA.
But you see what he espouses, and I think this is once again reflective of the effort of far left candidates to present themselves as moderates when in fact we know they're not.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kayleigh Lines. I'm Joe Matthew. Part of our conversation there with the former governor of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin, with us on Balance of Power addressing Abdul Ed-Sayed's victory in Michigan's Democratic Senate primary. Joining us now is our political panel as we pick up that conversation this evening. John McCarthy, former senior advisor for political engagement to President Biden, principal of Causeway Strategy Group, and Lonnie Chen, former advisor of Mitt Romney, Marco Rubio, and partner and co-lead of U.S. Public Affairs at Brunswick Group. Gentlemen, it's great to see you both. And John, I'll start with you on this because you're out with a new op-ed that I noticed at Midas Touch, what Democrats need to learn from Michigan in order to unite. You know, there were lots of pancake breakfasts today in Michigan talking about uniting the party here, but it's a lot easier said than done. What message do moderates need to send to progressives?
Well, I mean, I would say that I'm for more pancake breakfasts in politics across the board. Democrats
I'm with you on that.
So I'm for that. But I will say, you know, raise the flag. The Civil War needs to kind of stop because it really only exists inside the minds of kind of Beltway insiders. Most voters don't really sort themselves into categories of either being centrists or progressives. In fact, most voters kind of hold tendencies of both. So for both of these wings of the Democratic Party, I think that they need to do something that they're going to be pretty uncomfortable with. I mean, moderates need to accept the fact that people don't see us fighting hard enough. Moderates want to hand you a white paper and tell you about their policy idea, but they don't really have the energy or the excitement to kind of meet this moment. That needs to change because their policies do well with the American people. Voters just don't think that they're really able to sell it. And the tough thing is for progressives, they need to acknowledge the fact that, you know, their candidates go too far on these fringy issues and the American people just are not with them. You know, Democrats should have the courage to stand up and say that anyone who says they're going to wipe their hands with the American flag doesn't have a place in our party. We should say that those things are extreme because that's what voters want. So the blend that needs to happen for Democrats to be a majority party again needs to be that, one, we need to show that we have some fight in us, but two, that we also have the values of normal people.
Are there opportunities, Lonnie, for Republicans to capture at least some of those who would have traditionally leaned Democrat if they can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again?
I do think so. I mean, I think that's been the lesson of the Trump era to some degree, is that when you embrace policies that have a little bit more, let's say, of a populist edge, that are designed to appeal more to the fact that we've had significant economic disruption throughout many parts of our country, the trade policies, for example, which are highly offensive to many traditional Republicans, probably are calibrated to gain the support, frankly, of more moderate, maybe even left-leaning voters in many parts of the country. So if you look at Michigan and Wisconsin and Iowa and Ohio, states that previously had been very difficult for Republicans to access, one of the reasons why Republicans have gained traction in those states is because we see policy agendas that are broader from the Republican Party now than you may have seen. I think the danger, certainly more for the Democratic Party now, is that that party will be defined by ideas that are fundamentally out of touch with most Americans, like a complete government takeover of health care, like, for example, public ownership of major private entities. I think these are the sorts of things that really put Democrats in danger of appearing out of touch, not just with people who are Democrats, but the broad majority of Americans across the political spectrum.
Lonnie, we want to get to some other things, but you must have some scar tissue from the whole Tea Party movement. What lessons did you learn that you can share with John?
Well, look, the intra-party fights are almost worse than the ones, you know, between the two parties. When you're fighting with your own family, it can be very difficult, and I think, frankly, can get very bloody. But the reality is that there's an energy you're trying to harness there, right? During the Tea Party movement, there was an energy that Republicans were trying to harness. I remember back to that 2012 primary, we were running against, you know, Michelle Bachmann, and that name is a blast from the past. But, you know, that sort of energy in the Republican Party. I think the Democrats are facing a similar challenge now, which is how do they navigate this effort to be more appealing to more Americans while recognizing that definitionally they are increasingly being boxed in by the Al-Sayeds, by the Francesca Hongs, by people who espouse views that frankly are out of touch with most Americans.
Well, he raises Francesca Hong, so I got to ask you, John, about the whole Thanksgiving thing as we look ahead to that next week.
Yeah, I mean, it shouldn't be that hard for someone to sit and say, no, that was a crazy thing to say. And that's what I think more Democrats need to get a backbone and start doing. Because part of the problem is the vast majority of our candidates, the people inside the Democratic tent, are not Democratic socialists. Republicans are going to try and paint us as that. And what we need to do is ensure that that label doesn't feel true. When you have candidates like Jon Ossoff or you have candidates like Roy Cooper, you can try and paint them like that. And the president and the Republicans are going to try and do so. But it just doesn't feel authentic to them. them. So I think that as a whole, the party needs to just say it simply in ways that people understand, that that was a crazy thing to say.
Well, now I want turkey, but we're talking affordability here, and pretty soon, Lonnie and John, we're going to have stories about the cost of a Thanksgiving meal, because this is the story right now. It's affordability that's driving all of the issues that we're talking about here. And I'll tell you, the Brunswick Group is out with some really interesting numbers, Lonnie. We've been looking forward to getting you back on to ask you about them with your poll that has to do with politics, yes, but how it bleeds through on the corporate side. This is right up our alley here at Bloomberg. The 3 tests that CEOs will face through the 2026 midterms. And you're bringing CEOs to school here with the issue of affordability. 54% of voters with household incomes below $75,000 a year say the American dream is not achievable for most Americans. Does corporate America understand this better than the political class?
I don't know that it does right now. And I think that's part of the challenge, Joe, is that you do have a situation where the majority of Americans feel like they can't afford things they need to afford. And they do set that, at least in some part, at the feet of corporate leaders. And I think it's incumbent upon companies to recognize that this affordability challenge is very real. I think there's other challenges as well, which is, for example, how have companies reacted to the political environment? Have they been too much on one side or another? We ask it as, whose side have you been on? And then there's a credibility question beyond that, which is, are companies credible when they talk about their efforts to enhance affordability for the American people? And the disconnect that happens between corporate leaders specifically. So Americans, for example, are very, very pessimistic about CEOs and about leaders, even if they're slightly more comfortable with the companies that those CEOs lead. So there's a lot of challenges going into this election cycle that stem from this affordability crisis and where we stand in the economy right now.
Yeah, fascinating finding in this poll that 23% cite corporate greed and excessive profits as a top message for CEOs. And John, I'll come to you on this because we heard a lot about this during the Biden administration, the suggestions of price gouging. And history is kind of repeating itself or rhyming a little bit, as just this week in the Oval Office, President Trump once again was criticizing big oil for the profits they've made as oil prices have surged due to the war in Iran. It seems like both sides are focused on that issue.
One of the tough realities is that presidents, often have little control over the economy of which they're governing, but, are held accountable for it. If you want to talk about the politics here, though, midterms are always referendums on the party in power. The Republican Party controls every branch of government at this moment. So I think it's going to be pretty difficult for Republicans in the House and President Trump to be able to distance themselves from this economy. One of the tricky things, though, is that I think if you ask most rank and file House members behind closed doors, they would tell you that the president is not doing enough to keep them on message of trying to make the case that they are doing things on affordability. When you see the president talking about things such as ballrooms or arches or not signing a bipartisan housing bill, these members who are in tough districts are the ones who are really going to have to bear the brunt of that when they go home. So, Republicans have the challenge of between now and November trying to reorient our politics towards some fight from them showing that they're doing something to lower costs. I think that ship has probably sailed, so that's going to be a pretty tough political equation for them.
All right, Lonnie Chen and John McCarthy, thank you both for being our political panel this evening. And as John mentions, the notion of going home, it's still not clear as we approach 6 p.m. whether or not the Senate's going to be coming home tonight, tomorrow, anytime soon.
They'll be here
when they'll get to their business on the floor.
What did Senator Cramer said by 11 o'clock tonight they'll know? Yeah. It's too late to fly by then. We'll see you all back here tomorrow, I think is the answer.
Indeed we will. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power right here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.